Before we watch a God complex burn itself down, hit subscribe so you do not miss the rest of the Resident Evil deep dives. It also tells me if you would like more videos or not. This is the full story of Albert Wesker, the genius who outplayed entire corporations, betrayed everyone he ever worked with. Part 1. The Wesker Project begins. The man known to the world as Albert Wesker was never intended to be a human being in the traditional or biological sense of the word. To his creator, Oswell A. Spencer, the boy was simply subject number 013, a high-value genetic asset within a top-secret eugenics initiative known as the Wesker Project. This program was the architectural foundation of Spencer's grand vision for a new world order, where a race of superior humans would serve as the elite guardians of a global utopia. Albert was one of several hundred children abducted or adopted from across the globe, based on their high-tier genetic potential and their innate intellectual aptitude. These children were selected because they represented the peak of human biological possibility, but they were stripped of their names and their histories to become blank slates for Umbrella's social and biological engineering. The goal of the project was to create a generation of gods who would be loyal only to Spencer and the corporation. The iron logic of the Wesker Project was that true leadership could only be achieved through artificial selection and the total erasure of the human spirit. Spencer believed that the current human race was a failed experiment, a species of weak-willed and physically inferior creatures who were standing in the way of true progress. By creating a generation of children of the project, Spencer hoped to bypass the slow and messy process of natural evolution. Albert was raised in an environment where his every movement was monitored, and his every thought was scrutinized by a board of clinical observers. He was never given the warmth of a family or the comfort of a childhood home. He was given a series of umbrella-funded institutions where the only curriculum was elitism and the only goal was perfection. This was the original sin of the Wesker legacy, the belief that a man can be manufactured into a god through the sheer force of corporate will and the total suppression of empathy. Furthermore, the project was designed to be a competition of the most brutal and final variety. The hundreds of children were not meant to coexist, but to be filtered through a series of increasingly lethal tests. As the children grew, those who showed even the slightest signs of physical weakness or intellectual hesitation were quietly disposed of, or reassigned to become lower-level research subjects for viral testing. Albert survived this process not through luck, but through a cold and calculated efficiency that set him apart from the other subjects. He understood early on that in Spencer's world, survival was the only metric of success, and that compassion was a terminal illness. This created a profound psychological detachment in the boy, as he learned to view his peers as rivals to be overcome, or obstacles to be removed, rather than friends to be cherished. By the time he reached adulthood, Albert Wesker had been thoroughly conditioned to believe that he was inherently superior to everyone around him, a belief that would eventually become the fuel for his global ambitions and his eventual madness. The sorrow of the Wesker Project begins with the realization that Albert was robbed of his humanity before he even knew what it was. He was a creature of the laboratory, a product of a corporation that viewed the soul as a biological inefficiency. Spencer did not want a son or a successor. He wanted a tool that could carry his legacy of blood into the next century. This environment of absolute control and calculated expectation forged a man who was incapable of forming genuine bonds and obsessed with the acquisition of power as a form of self-validation. The project succeeded in creating a superior specimen of the human form, but it failed to recognize that a weapon without a conscience, is a weapon that will eventually turn on its creator. Albert Wesker was the crowning achievement of the 1960s eugenics movement, and he was the first and most dangerous monster that Umbrella ever produced. He was the perfect soldier of a world that values power over life, and he would eventually bring that world to its knees. Part 2. Childhood without humanity. The upbringing of Albert Wesker was a masterclass in the systematic erasure of the human spirit through the use of clinical isolation and rigorous psychological conditioning. While other children were learning the nuances of social interaction and emotional connection, Albert was immersed in a world of total isolation from ordinary society. He was educated in Umbrella, funded academies that functioned more like high-security research facilities than schools. In these environments, the concept of empathy was treated as a biological weakness, a leftover trait from an inferior evolutionary stage that had no place in the New World Order. Albert was taught that the masses were clay, to be molded or discarded, and that his only responsibility was to his own advancement and the fulfillment of Spencer's vision. This environment stripped him of the ability to form genuine human bonds, replacing the heart with a cold and calculating sense of engineered superiority that left him entirely alone, even in a room full of people. The clinical reality of Albert's youth was one of perpetual and intrusive surveillance. Every academic achievement, every physical milestone, and every psychological response was recorded and analyzed by a team of Umbrella scientists who treated him like a specimen rather than a child. He was not allowed to have hobbies or interests that did not contribute to his tactical or intellectual growth. If he showed a single moment of hesitation or a single flash of normal human emotion, it was corrected through intensive psychological retraining and chemical intervention. This process ensured that by the time he was a teenager, Albert had become a singular instrument of corporate ambition. He viewed the world through a tactical lens, where every interaction was a game of chess, and every person was a piece to be moved or sacrificed according to the needs of the board. This total isolation from the human experience was the catalyst for the God complex that would define his later life. Furthermore, the education provided by Umbrella was designed to reinforce the idea that Albert was a member of a divine elite who stood above the laws of men. He was told that he was the future of the species, and that the rules of morality and ethics did not apply to someone of his stature. This was a dangerous and toxic ideology to plant in the mind of a child who had never known the warmth of a parent's love or the guidance of a moral compass. It created a vacuum where a conscience should have been, and filled it with a bottomless hunger for dominance and control. Albert began to see himself as a predator among prey, a belief that was confirmed every time he surpassed a peer or completed a task that would have broken a normal human. He was a Wesker, and in his mind, that name was a title of nobility that gave him the right to rule over the inferior billions who inhabited the earth. The legacy of this childhood without humanity was a man who was perfectly suited for the dark work of the Umbrella Corporation, but utterly ill-equipped for a meaningful human existence. Albert Wesker was a masterpiece of conditioning, a soldier of the elite who could kill without remorse and lead without hesitation. But the cost of this perfection was the total loss of the self. He had been so thoroughly molded by Spencer and the corporation that he no longer knew where the project ended and Albert began. This internal emptiness was the drive behind his constant pursuit of power. He was trying to fill a void that had been created in the sterile hallways of his youth. He was a man with the mind of a genius and the physical prowess of a world-class athlete, but he was a ghost in the machine of his own existence, haunted by the humanity he had been denied and the father who had manufactured him for his own ends. Part 3. The virus inside him. One of the most guarded secrets of the Wesker Project was the fact that long before the Raccoon City incident of 1998, Albert was already a carrier of a dormant and high-tier viral strain. This was the prototype virus, a unique biological agent developed by Oswell Spencer and his inner circle of researchers specifically for the Wesker children. The purpose of this virus was to serve as the final filter for the project, a biological test of godhood that would determine which of the candidates were truly worthy of leading the new world. Every one of the 13 primary Wesker children was administered this virus at a specific point in their development. The iron reality of this administration was that it was a death sentence for nearly all of them. Their bodies were unable to bond with the aggressive pathogen, resulting in immediate cellular collapse or horrific and painful mutation. Albert was one of the few whose DNA was robust enough to achieve a state of symbiotic potential with the virus without immediate rejection. However, the strain did not manifest its power immediately upon injection. It was designed to remain inactive, hidden in his neural pathways and his blood until a specific physiological trigger was met. For Albert, this trigger was the total and final cessation of his human biological functions, the act of dying itself. This meant that for years, Albert walked the halls of the Arklay laboratory and the streets of Raccoon City as a sleeping god, unaware of the full extent of the power that was resting in his veins. This viral latency gave him a subtle edge in his intellectual and physical pursuits, but it also made him a ticking time bomb of evolutionary potential. He was a biological weapon that was simply waiting for the right moment to fire and consume the world around him. The psychological impact of knowing he was a carrier of a prototype virus was profound and isolating. Even before the resurrection, Albert felt a sense of otherness that he could not fully explain to his human peers. He felt a disconnect from the mortality of his S.T.A.R.S teammates and a strange affinity for the biological horrors he was helping Umbrella create in the dark. He began to suspect that his relationship with Spencer was more complex than that of a mentor and a protege, and this suspicion fueled his private research into his own origins. He didn't just want to use the virus, he wanted to become the virus. He saw the prototype strain as his birthright, the final piece of the puzzle that would elevate him above the inferior race he had been forced to live among for so many years. The virus was not an infection to him, it was a graduation. The legacy of the virus inside him was the total transformation of his identity, from a man into a living weapon. When he finally triggered the resurrection in the Spencer mansion, he did not just heal from his wounds. He was rewritten from the inside out. The virus became the core of his being, granting him strength, speed, and a tactical awareness that surpassed anything humanly possible. But this power came with a permanent biological cost that he could never escape. He was no longer a self-sustaining organism. He was tied to the virus, requiring regular doses of the stabilizing agent PG67AW to prevent the strain from becoming unstable and consuming his consciousness. The virus gave him the world, but it also made him its permanent prisoner. Albert Wesker was the first true success of Spencer's biological vision, but he was also the first victim of a power that demanded everything in exchange for the illusion of godhood. Part 4. Hatred for Spencer takes root. While Albert Wesker appeared to be the most loyal and efficient servant of the Umbrella Corporation, a deep-seated and toxic resentment toward Oswell, Spencer began to form early in his career. This hatred for Spencer was not born of a single event, but was the result of the gradual and painful realization that Albert was viewed as a tool rather than a successor. As he ascended the corporate ladder, and gained access to the deeper archives of the company, Albert began to see the strings that were attached to his life. He saw that his education, his career, and even his physical biology were the products of Spencer's ego and desire for immortality. He was not a partner in the New World Order. He was a subject whose only purpose was to prove that Spencer's theories on eugenics and viral evolution were correct. This realization was a devastating blow to Albert's engineered sense of superiority, and it planted the seeds of a rebellion that would eventually consume them both. The psychological shift in Wesker was characterized by a decision that if he was meant to be a god, he would not be a subordinate one. He began to view Spencer as a relic of an older world, a man who was obsessed with the past, while Albert was the embodiment of the future. The resentment grew as he watched Spencer hide away in his estates and laboratories, playing God from the safety of his wealth, while Albert was in the field doing the heavy lifting of the bio-warfare revolution. Albert decided that he would take the throne Spencer had built for himself by any means necessary. He began to plot a slow and meticulous sabotage of Umbrella's interests, using his position as a high-level researcher and tactical commander to gather intelligence for his own private empire. He was no longer working for Spencer. He was working for the version of Albert Wesker that would one day replace his creator. Furthermore, the hatred was fueled by the Wesker Project revelation, which stripped away the last of his loyalty. When Albert discovered the full extent of the child experimentation and the fate of the other 12 subjects, he felt a mixture of contempt and competition. He didn't hate Spencer for the cruelty of the project. He hated Spencer for the arrogance of thinking he could control a creature as superior as Albert. He saw the project as a challenge, a game of biological chess that he intended to win by destroying the Grandmaster. Every successful experiment he conducted and every secret he stole was a strike against the father who had tried to own him. The relationship between the two men became a cold war of elite egos, where the prize was the future of the human race. Wesker became a master of the double game, maintaining the facade of the perfect corporate soldier while secretly dismantling the foundations of Umbrella's power from within. The legacy of this hatred was the total isolation of Albert Wesker from the rest of humanity. By rejecting his creator, he was also rejecting his only tie to a shared history or a purpose greater than himself. He became a man without a country and without a cause other than his own ascension. This resentment blinded him to the fact that in his quest to destroy Spencer, he was becoming exactly like him. A cold, detached megalomaniac who viewed the world as a laboratory and people as subjects. The tragedy of Albert's hatred was that it was the only thing that kept him tethered to Spencer. He spent his entire life trying to prove he was more than a tool, only to find that his every move was still a reaction to the man who had created him. He was a god in rebellion, but he was still a god who was defined by the shadow of his creator and the chains of his birth. Part 5. Joining S.T.A.R.S. In the year 1996, Albert Wesker made the tactical decision to infiltrate the Raccoon City Police Department by becoming the leader of the newly formed Special Tactics and Rescue Service, known as S.T.A.R.S. This was a dual-purpose infiltration that served the interests of both Umbrella and his own emerging agenda for personal power. To the public and his fellow officers, Wesker was the peak of professional law enforcement, a decorated commander who was dedicated to the safety of the city and its citizens. To Umbrella, he was the mole inside the department, ensuring that any investigation into the strange occurrences in the Arklay Mountains was suppressed or redirected. But for Wesker himself, joining S.T.A.R.S. was about something much deeper. It was about the acquisition of peak human talent and the refinement of his own tactical dominance in the field. Wesker's leadership of the Alpha team was a performance of the highest and most deceptive order. He meticulously selected members like Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine, not for their dedication to justice, but for their high genetic potential and their exceptional combat skills. He viewed these heroes as biological variables rather than teammates or friends. He spent 2 years observing their combat patterns, their mental resilience, and their ability to function under extreme pressure. He was grooming them to be the ultimate test subjects for Umbrella's upcoming combat data trials in the Spencer Mansion. By leading them from the front, he could gain their absolute trust, ensuring that when the time came to lead them into a slaughterhouse, they would follow him without hesitation. The STARS unit was his personal focus group, a laboratory in the field where he could study the limits of human endurance. The manipulation of the Raccoon City Police Department and the city government was a masterclass in corporate espionage and social engineering. Wesker used his influence to ensure that the STARS budget was bloated with Umbrella funding, allowing him to equip the team with the very weapons and technology that would eventually be tested against them. He acted as the gateway between the corporation and the local authorities, creating a buffer zone that protected Umbrella's research from any genuine public oversight. The iron reality of his position was that he was the gatekeeper of the apocalypse. He knew that the mansion incident was coming, and he spent every day in the police station preparing the pieces of the board for the final play. He was not protecting Raccoon City. He was preparing it for its role as a funeral pyre for the old human race and a birthplace for the new. The legacy of joining STARS was the creation of his most enduring and lethal rivalries. By choosing Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine as his primary subjects, he was unknowingly picking the two people who would eventually lead to his ultimate downfall. His arrogance led him to believe that he could control these peak humans forever, through fear and manipulation, but he failed to account for the unpredictable and resilient nature of the human spirit. The STARS era was the peak of Wesker's human career, a time when he proved that he could manipulate the highest levels of society with ease and grace. But it was also the beginning of the end of his secrecy. By inviting the heroes into his world, he gave them the keys to unlock the door to his destruction. Albert Wesker, in his STARS uniform, was a man at the height of his powers, but he was also a man who was about to learn that even a god can be thwarted by a sufficiently determined mortal. Part 6. Manipulating Chris and Jill. During his tenure as the commander of the STARS Alpha team, Albert Wesker viewed his subordinates not as comrades, but as elite biological specimens in a longitudinal study of human potential. The manipulation of Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine was the primary focus of his 2-year assignment in Raccoon City. Wesker recognized that Chris possessed an extraordinary level of physical resilience and marksman accuracy, while Jill exhibited a unique mental flexibility and a mastery of environmental navigation. To Wesker, these were not admirable human traits, but high-value data points. He spent hundreds of hours observing their performance in training exercises and minor urban tactical operations, meticulously recording how their heart rates spiked under pressure and how their decision-making patterns evolved in high-stress environments. He was essentially grooming them to become the ultimate benchmarks for the biological weapons Umbrella was developing in secret. The psychological game Wesker played was one of curated trust and professional admiration. He cultivated a persona of the stoic and hyper-competent leader who valued the lives of his team above all else. This was a necessary deception to ensure that when the final test arrived, Chris and Jill would follow his orders without question, even if those orders led them into the jaws of a biological nightmare. Wesker took a perverse pleasure in this manipulation, viewing it as proof of his intellectual superiority. He saw himself as the grand master of a chessboard, where Chris and Jill were the most powerful pieces, unaware that they were being moved toward a sacrifice. Every supportive word and every tactical recommendation he gave was a calculated lie designed to strengthen the bond of loyalty that he intended to shatter for the sake of combat data and personal profit. Furthermore, Wesker utilized his position to isolate his two star pupils from any outside influence that might expose the true nature of Umbrella. He ensured that any rumors regarding the strange cannibalistic murders in the Arklay Mountains were funneled through his office, allowing him to control the flow of information. He intentionally delayed the S.T.A.R.S investigation into the mountains until the viral leak at the Spencer estate had reached a point of maximum volatility. He wanted the team to enter the mansion when the biological organic weapons were at their most aggressive and unpredictable. This was the ultimate betrayal of the commander to subordinate relationship. He was not leading a rescue mission. He was leading a field trial where the subjects were the very people who looked up to him as a mentor and a protector. The legacy of this manipulation was the creation of a trauma that would define Chris and Jill for the rest of their lives. Wesker did not just put their bodies in danger. He attempted to dismantle their faith in human integrity. He wanted them to realize that their bravery was a variable to be exploited, and that their survival was merely a recorded outcome in a corporate ledger. This period of manipulation proves that Wesker was a predator of the mind, as much as a predator of the body. He understood that the most effective way to test a weapon was to pit it against the best humanity had to offer, and he chose his subjects with a cold and surgical precision that reflected his own engineered lack of empathy. By the time the helicopters took off for the Arklay Mountains, the trap was already set and the two heroes were already walking into Wesker's private hell. Part 7. The Mansion Experiment. The events of July 1998 at the Spencer estate were never intended to be a containment operation, but were instead the culmination of the mansion experiment. This was a live fire exercise designed by Albert Wesker to test the effectiveness of Umbrella's primary biological weapons against the world's most elite human soldiers. The S.T.A.R.S units were the unconsenting participants in a tactical benchmarking study that would determine the market value of creatures like the Hunter Alpha and the Tyrant T-002. Wesker orchestrated the mission to ensure that the team was forced to navigate the labyrinthine corridors of the estate while being hunted by various viral mutations. He watched from the security monitors as his team was slowly picked apart, recording the combat data with a level of clinical detachment that would be impossible for any normal human being. The mansion experiment was the final filter for the S.T.A.R.S project. Wesker wanted to see which viral strains produced the most efficient killers and how much pressure a peak human could withstand before succumbing to fear or physical exhaustion. He intentionally left clues and limited resources scattered throughout the house to observe how Chris and Jill utilized their environment to survive. To Wesker, the death of a team member like Joseph Frost or Forrest Speyer was not a loss, but a failure of the biological variable. He viewed the blood on the floors of the mansion as the ink in his research journal. This was the moment where Wesker fully embraced his role as the architect of horror, realizing that the data gathered in these halls would be worth more to the global bioweapon market than the lives of 1,000 soldiers. Furthermore, the mansion served as the stage for Wesker's own personal transition. He utilized the chaos of the mission to initiate his exit strategy from the Umbrella Corporation. He had already established contact with a rival organization, and he intended to use the S.T.A.R.S combat data as his ticket into a new world of power. The mansion experiment was his resume, a demonstration of his ability to manage a high-stakes biological crisis while manipulating both sides of the conflict. He was playing a triple game, serving Spencer by conducting the test, serving the rival company by stealing the data, and serving himself by preparing for his own biological ascension. The mansion was the crucible where Wesker intended to burn away his human ties and emerge as something entirely different. The legacy of the mansion experiment was the total destruction of the S.T.A.R.S unit and the permanent scarring of the survivors. It proved that Umbrella was no longer a pharmaceutical company, but a manufacturer of extinction. Wesker's willingness to sacrifice his own team demonstrated that he had fully internalized the eugenics philosophy of his youth. The mansion was the first time the world saw the true face of the virus and the true face of Albert Wesker. It was a place where the laws of nature were suspended and replaced by the laws of the laboratory. By the end of the night, the mansion would be in ruins, but the data extracted from its halls would ensure that the cycle of biological terror would continue for decades to come, with Wesker as its primary beneficiary. Part 8. Wesker dies. The moment where the tyrant T-002 impaled Albert Wesker in the laboratory beneath the Spencer estate was not a failure of his planning, but the most calculated risk of his life. This event, known as Wesker Dies, was a choreographed suicide designed to trigger the prototype virus dormant in his blood. Wesker knew that the virus required a near-death or total death event to initiate its primary resurrection protocols, and he chose the claw of the tyrant as his instrument of transformation. He allowed himself to be physically destroyed in front of his surviving teammates to achieve two specific goals: the faking of his own death to escape Umbrella's oversight, and the biological rebirth into a superhuman state. He stood before the monster with a cold smile, knowing that his human life was over and his existence as a god was about to begin. The clinical reality of this death was a state of temporary biological cessation. For several minutes, Albert Wesker was legally and physically dead. His heart stopped, his neural activity plummeted, and his cellular structure began to succumb to the trauma of the tyrant's attack. It was during this period of darkness that the prototype virus began its work. The pathogen, which had been hidden in his DNA for decades, recognized the failure of the host and initiated an aggressive and rapid repair of his entire biology. The virus didn't just heal the wound, it began to rewrite his genetic code, integrating itself with his nervous system and muscular structure. This was the resurrection protocol that Spencer had designed for his chosen children, and Wesker was the first to successfully navigate the transition from the grave. Furthermore, the act of dying was a psychological liberation for Wesker. By killing the S.T.A.R.S commander, he was effectively erasing the last of his human obligations and corporate ties. When he eventually opened his eyes, he was no longer a subject of the project or an employee of Umbrella. He was a self-actualized biological anomaly. He had tricked the world into believing he was gone, allowing him to operate from the shadows with total freedom. This was the ultimate master of unlocking move. He had picked the lock of death itself to escape the cage of his own past. He rose from the floor of the laboratory with a new perspective, seeing the world not as a place of laws and societies, but as a playground for a being of his stature. The legacy of Wesker Dies was the birth of the modern biohazard era's most dangerous antagonist. The man who walked out of the exploding Spencer estate was not the same man who had entered it. He had traded his mortality for power and his reputation for secrecy. This event demonstrated the absolute commitment Wesker had to his own evolution. He was willing to endure the agony of a tyrant's claw and the coldness of the grave to prove that he was superior to the constraints of the human form. His death was the final lie of his human career and the foundation of his divine ambition. From that moment on, Albert Wesker would be a ghost haunting the global stage, a shadow that proved that sometimes the most dangerous thing about a monster is that it was once a man who chose to die. Part 9. Resurrection through the virus. The process of resurrection through the virus was far more than a simple healing of wounds. It was a total and violent restructuring of Albert Wesker's physical and mental state. When the prototype virus finished its work, Wesker did not simply wake up. He was reborn with a biology that defied the limitations of the human species. The virus had integrated itself into his muscular system, granting him a density and explosive power that allowed him to punch through solid steel and move at speeds that were nearly invisible to the human eye. His nervous system was hyper-accelerated, allowing his brain to process visual information in fragmented milliseconds, granting him the reflexes of an apex predator. He was no longer a man who had been enhanced. He was a viral hybrid whose every cell was vibrating with the energy of the infection. The clinical cost of this resurrection was a state of permanent biological instability. While the virus gave him godlike powers, it also created a ravenous and constant demand for stability. Wesker discovered that his new form was in a state of perpetual metabolic flux, and without regular intervention, he would eventually lose his humanity entirely and succumb to a non-selective mutation. This led to his dependence on the chemical compound PG67AW, a stabilizer that acted as a chemical leash for the virus. He had become a superhuman, but he was now a slave to a new master, his own blood. This irony was not lost on Wesker. He had escaped Spencer only to find that he was now dependent on the very pharmaceutical research that Spencer had pioneered. His strength was absolute, but it was purchased at the price of a life lived in a laboratory of his own making. Furthermore, the resurrection altered his psychological profile toward a state of total emotional detachment. The rush of power and the speed of his perception made human concerns seem trivial and slow. He began to view time and space differently, seeing the movements of ordinary people as sluggish and inefficient. This widened the gap between him and the rest of the species, leading to the full crystallization of his God complex. He truly believed that his survival was proof of a divine right to rule, and that the inferior billions were simply fodder for the next stage of global evolution. He didn't just feel superior, he felt like a different category of existence entirely. The resurrection had successfully purged the last remnants of empathy from his mind, leaving only the cold and calculated pursuit of total dominance. The legacy of the resurrection was the emergence of a threat that the world was entirely unprepared to handle. Wesker became a phantom operative, stealing the T. Veronica and G. virus samples, and building his own private bioweapon empire from the ruins of Umbrella. He was the perfect predator, a man who could walk through a hail of bullets and vanish before the first shell hit the ground. This part of his journey proves that the greatest danger of the viruses was not the monsters they created in the labs, but the monster they created in the man. Albert Wesker was the living proof that the pursuit of perfection leads only to a state of absolute isolation, where the only thing left to do is to watch the world burn from the heights of a self-made throne. Part 10. Superhuman Reality. The superhuman reality that Albert Wesker inhabited following his resurrection was one of profound power an absolute alienation. He lived in a world where physical obstacles no longer existed. He could fall from great heights and land without injury. He could catch bullets in the palm of his hand, and he could cross a room in the blink of an eye. This physical dominance transformed his tactical approach to everything. He no longer needed to hide in the shadows or rely on subordinates. He could simply walk into any facility and take what he wanted through the sheer force of his presence. His new biology was a suit of armor that protected him from the consequences of the world. But this reality also meant that he could no longer relate to the human experience of pain, fear, or fatigue. He had become a biological machine, and the world was his test bench. The clinical expression of this reality was a state of hyper-awareness that bordered on the divine. Wesker's eyes, which often glowed with a predatory orange hue, were capable of seeing things that were invisible to the naked eye, such as the heat signatures of hidden enemies and the subtle vibrations of machinery. This sensory overload would have driven a normal human insane, but Wesker utilized it to maintain a state of total control over his environment. However, the iron reality of his superhuman state was the emotional numbing that accompanied it. Because he was so far beyond the threats of the world, he began to lose the ability to feel anything at all. His rivalry with Chris Redfield became one of the few things that could still spark a sense of engagement in his mind, because Chris represented a challenge to his supposedly perfect existence. Furthermore, his superhuman reality necessitated a life of constant chemical management. The God complex was real, but the God was fragile. He spent a significant portion of his time monitoring his own viral levels and administering the PG-67AW injections. This was the secret burden of the superhuman. He was like a high-performance engine that required constant tuning and specialized fuel to keep from exploding. If he missed a dose, or if the dosage was incorrect, he would begin to lose his mental clarity, and his physical form would start to warp. This dependency was the one tether that kept him grounded in the world of science and medicine. He was a god who was still a subject of the laboratory, and he hated every second of it. This tension fueled his desire to create a world where everyone was like him, where the leash of the stabilizer was no longer necessary. The legacy of Wesker's superhuman reality was the total collapse of his remaining moral constraints. When you are a god among insects, the insects' lives become meaningless. He began to view the human race as an outdated model of life that needed to be forcibly replaced. This was the ideological foundation for his final plan, the Uroboros Project. He wanted to force the rest of the world through the same crucible of death and resurrection that he had survived. He believed that the few who survived would be a new elite race, and the billions who died would be the necessary cost of progress. His superhuman reality was a lonely one, and he was determined to drag the rest of the world into it, whether they wanted to go or not. Albert Wesker was the architect of a new evolution, but he was also the primary victim of the isolation that comes with absolute power. Part 11. No More Umbrella Loyalty. Following his resurrection beneath the ruins of the Spencer estate, Albert Wesker underwent a profound shift in his allegiances that signaled the true beginning of his solo quest for global dominance. The realization that he was the successful result of a eugenics project meant that he no longer viewed himself as an employee of the Umbrella Corporation, but as its rightful heir. However, he also recognized that the company was a sinking ship, weighed down by the bureaucratic incompetence of its leadership and the public relations disaster of the Raccoon City incident. This led to a period of no more Umbrella loyalty, where Wesker transitioned into a rogue agent of chaos. He realized that the company's traditional structure was a cage that limited his potential, and he began working for various rival organizations, such as the mysterious entity known only as the Organization, while secretly building his own private bioweapon empire from the shadows. Wesker's abandonment of Umbrella was not merely a career move, it was a rejection of the father who had created him. By stealing the research data from the mansion and the later viral samples from the Raccoon City outbreak, he was effectively strip mining the company for its most valuable assets before allowing it to collapse. He took a cold, clinical pleasure in watching the multi-billion-dollar empire of Oswell Spencer crumble under the weight of legal investigations and tactical failures. To Wesker, the T-virus and the G-virus were tools that he had perfected through his own fieldwork, and he felt no obligation to share the fruits of his labor with the lesser men who ran the corporate boards. He became a free agent operative, a biological mercenary who used his superhuman status to bypass traditional security and claim whatever resources he required to further his own research into human evolution. Furthermore, this shift in loyalty allowed Wesker to explore viral strains that Umbrella had deemed too unstable or too dangerous for commercial development. He became obsessed with the T. Veronica virus and the potential of the G virus to rewrite the genetic code of an entire population. He saw himself as the only one with the intellectual and biological fortitude to manage these pathogens. Without the constraints of corporate oversight, his experiments became increasingly reckless and ambitious. He was no longer trying to create a product for a market. He was trying to create a world in his own image. This was the era where the modern bioterrorist was born, a figure who possessed the resources of a superpower but the accountability of a ghost. Wesker had outgrown Umbrella, and in doing so, he became a threat that was far more dangerous than the company that had birthed him. The legacy of this broken loyalty was a decentralization of biological terror. By stealing and selling Umbrella's secrets to the highest bidders, Wesker ensured that the virus would never truly be contained. He was the primary driver of the global black market for bioorganic weapons, fueling conflicts across the globe to gather more combat data for his own projects. He had become the ultimate master of unlocking, opening the doors to a future where the human race was no longer at the top of the food chain. This period proved that Wesker's only true loyalty was to his own evolution and the destruction of anything that dared to claim ownership over his life. He was a god in the making, and the ruins of Umbrella were merely the first bricks in the foundation of his new world. Part 12. The God Complex fully forms. By the early 2000 period, the psychological state of Albert Wesker had shifted from cold ambition to a total and irreversible God complex. His continued survival of the prototype virus, combined with his physical dominance over every opponent he faced, convinced him that he had achieved a divine status. He no longer viewed himself as a member of the human species, but as the first true instance of a new evolutionary tier. This was the point where humanity became inferior clay in his mind, a mass of biological waste that existed only to be refined or discarded. The God complex was not merely a delusion of grandeur. It was a clinical assessment based on his perception, defying speed, and his ability to ignore the laws of biology that governed every other living thing. He lived in a state of absolute intellectual and physical isolation, where no one was his equal and everyone was his subject. The clinical expression of this complex was a total lack of regard for human life or social order. Wesker began to speak of a great cleansing, a global event that would filter the human race through the crucible of a new virus, leaving only those with the genetic resilience to match his own. He viewed himself as the judge and the architect of this new era, believing that he had a divine right to decide who lived and who died. This was the final evolution of Spencer's eugenics philosophy, stripped of its corporate trappings and focused into the singular ego of a man who could not be killed. Every action he took, from the kidnapping of Jill Valentine to the development of the Uroboros virus, was a step toward the realization of this godhood. He was tired of managing the chaos of the old world. He wanted to sit atop the new one. Furthermore, the god complex made Wesker increasingly predictable in his arrogance. Because he believed he was untouchable, he stopped viewing threats with the same tactical caution he had exhibited as a STARS commander. He began to play with his enemies, specifically Chris Redfield, whom he viewed as a curiosity rather than a threat. He wanted his victims to recognize his divinity before they were destroyed, a need for validation that proved he was still tethered to his human origins, even as he tried to deny them. He wanted the world to look up at him and scream, and then he wanted to be the one to silence the noise. This was the paradox of the Wesker Godhead. He claimed to be beyond humanity, yet his entire mission was driven by a very human need for revenge and recognition. The legacy of the fully formed God complex was the Uroboros Project, a plan for total global saturation that would either elevate humanity or end it. Wesker was no longer interested in wealth or corporate power. He wanted to be the biological center of the universe. This period demonstrated the danger of a superior mind that loses its connection to reality. He had become a god in his own mind, but the iron reality was that he was still a biological entity that required stabilizing chemicals and tactical maintenance. His complex was the armor that hid his vulnerability, but it was also the blindfold that would eventually lead to his downfall. Albert Wesker was a god who forgot that even a god can be bled if the enemy is determined enough. Part 13. Hunted by the Past. As Albert Wesker ascended toward his goal of global saturation, he found himself perpetually hunted by the past, specifically in the form of Chris Redfield. Despite his superhuman speed and his vast bioweapon empire, Wesker could not escape the shadow of the 1998 mansion incident. Chris became the singular crack in his perception of his own divinity. Every time Wesker devised a master plan, it was Chris who was there to dismantle it, often through sheer human grit and tactical luck. This created a reckless rivalry that began to cloud Wesker's strategic judgment. He found himself dedicating more resources to the psychological torture of Chris than to the actual implementation of his global vision. The past was not a memory to Wesker. It was an insult that refused to be silenced. The clinical reality of this obsession was a state of chronic frustration. Wesker could not understand how a weak human like Chris could repeatedly defy a being of his stature. To Wesker, Chris was a biological anomaly that needed to be studied and then destroyed to prove that the old human race was truly obsolete. However, every encounter between the two men only served to highlight Wesker's own hidden insecurities. He needed to defeat Chris, not just for tactical reasons, but to validate his own godhood. This obsession led him to take unnecessary risks, such as engaging in prolonged physical combat, when he could have simply ended the threat from a distance. The past had a hold on him that he could not break with speed or strength. It was a psychological anchor that kept him tethered to the very world he sought to destroy. Furthermore, being hunted by the past involved a constant re-evaluation of his own history as Subject 013. The spectre of Oswell Spencer remained a looming presence in Wesker's mind, a reminder that his power was a gift from a man he despised. Chris served as the physical manifestation of that era, a survivor of the Wesker Project era who refused to acknowledge the new order. This caused Wesker to alternate between cold calculation and outbursts of volcanic rage. He wasn't just fighting a soldier, he was fighting his own origins. He wanted to kill Chris to prove that the S.T.A.R.S era was truly dead, but by doing so, he was only keeping the memory of his human failure alive. The legacy of being hunted by the past was the eventual erosion of Wesker's tactical perfection. His obsession with Chris became his Achilles heel, a vulnerability that his enemies were able to exploit. This period proved that even a god can be distracted by the ghosts of his previous life. Albert Wesker was a man who was running toward the future with a terrifying speed, but he was always looking over his shoulder at the one man who knew exactly what he used to be. The past was the only thing Wesker couldn't outrun, and in the end, it would be the weight of those memories that would pull him down into the lava of the volcano. Part 14. Jill Valentine's Brainwashing. One of the darkest chapters in Albert Wesker's pursuit of power was the abduction and subsequent Jill Valentine's brainwashing, following the estate incident in 2006. After Jill sacrificed herself to save Chris by tackling Wesker through a window and over a cliff, Wesker utilized his superhuman resilience to survive the fall and capture her. Instead of simply killing her, he saw an opportunity to enact a profound psychological revenge on the S.T.A.R.S unit. He discovered that Jill possessed a unique immunity to the T virus and had developed antibodies that could be utilized to stabilize his own viral research. This led to the creation of the P-30 device, a mechanical apparatus attached to her chest that continuously administered a chemical stimulant to keep her in a state of hyper-focused, hypnotic obedience. The clinical reality of Jill's condition was a state of living death. She was conscious and aware of her actions, but lacked the individual will to resist Wesker's commands. She became his silent, hooded assassin, a tool used to hunt her own former teammates. For Wesker, this was a masterpiece of biological and psychological subversion. He took a perverse pleasure in watching the pure spirit of S.T.A.R.S be corrupted into a cold, mechanical killer. It was a tactical victory, as Jill was an exceptional combatant, but it was also a symbolic one. By turning Jill against Chris, Wesker was proving that even the strongest human will could be overridden by the power of science. He was playing God with the soul of his most capable rival, using her as a biological trophy of his dominance over the old guard. Furthermore, the brainwashing served as a long-term experiment in the limits of human mental resilience. Wesker monitored Jill's brain activity as she was forced to commit acts of violence against those she once protected. He wanted to see how long it would take for her identity to fully dissolve. This was a return to his roots in the Wesker Project, where children were stripped of their humanity to become tools. He was recreating his own trauma by inflicting it on another, a cycle of abuse that defined his psychological profile. Jill was no longer a person to him. She was a subject once more, a variable in a game designed to break the spirit of Chris Redfield. This cruelty was not a side effect of his mission. It was a primary objective, a way to prove that the human heart was just another lock that he could pick. The legacy of Jill Valentine's brainwashing was a trauma that would leave permanent scars on the survivors of S.T.A.R.S. Even after she was eventually freed by Chris and Shiva, the memory of her time as Wesker's puppet haunted her for years. For Wesker, it was a momentary triumph that ultimately backfired. By using Jill as a weapon, He provided Chris with the singular motivation needed to pursue him to the ends of the earth. His need for a psychological trophy was the very thing that ensured his enemies would never stop until he was destroyed. This period proved that Wesker's cruelty was his greatest weakness, a trait that turned a tactical advantage into a personal crusade for his enemies. Part 15. Why Wesker couldn't let Jill go. The question of why Wesker couldn't let Jill go after her capture in 2006 is one that reveals the deepest fractures in his supposedly perfect psyche. From a purely tactical standpoint, Jill was a high-value asset due to her antibodies and her combat skills. But Wesker's decision to keep her by his side as a personal bodyguard suggests a more complex psychological motive. Research into his behavioral patterns indicates that his obsession with Jill was a mix of strategic utility and a fractured subconscious attachment to his days as the S.T.A.R.S commander. She was a bridge to the only time in his life when he had experienced a semblance of social structure, even if that structure was built on a foundation of lies. By keeping her close, he was attempting to maintain a sense of total dominance over the Alpha Team era, proving that he could own the very people who had once trusted him. The clinical expression of this attachment was a form of predatory possession. Wesker viewed Jill as a trophy that validated his superiority over Chris. Every moment she spent under his control was a victory over the man he hated most. He enjoyed the power dynamic of being the master of a woman who had once been his peer. However, there was also an element of existential isolation. As a being who was unique in the world, Wesker was profoundly alone. By keeping Jill in a state of chemically induced obedience, he was creating a companion who could never leave him or defy him. It was a distorted, monstrous version of attachment, the only kind of love a person forged in the sterile labs of Umbrella was capable of feeling. She was the one thing from his past that he had successfully broken and remade, a proof of concept for his vision of a Uroboros world. Furthermore, his inability to let her go was a failure of his own logic. He claimed that the old world was meaningless and that the human race was obsolete, yet he could not sever the tie to the woman who represented that world's best qualities. She was a constant reminder of the failure of the mansion incident, a ghost that he tried to domesticate through the P-30 device. His obsession with her ultimately led to his downfall, as the time he spent maintaining her control and using her as a shield provided the window for Chris to finally discover his weakness. He was a god who was haunted by a mortal, and his refusal to simply kill her was the final proof that he was still a human being at his core, driven by the very emotions he claimed to have evolved beyond. The legacy of Wesker's refusal to let Jill go was the final collapse of his tactical efficiency. It was the emotional noise that prevented him from seeing the trap that was being set for him in the Kajuju region. This period demonstrated that no matter how much a virus rewrites the DNA, it cannot erase the fundamental psychological architecture of the host. Albert Wesker was a man who wanted to be a god, but he was held back by the gravity of his own petty grievances and fractured attachments. He died in a volcano because he couldn't let go of a woman who represented a past he claimed to have outgrown. He was a master of unlocking every door except the one that led away from his own obsession. Part 16. The Uroboros Obsession. The final evolution of Albert Wesker's grand design shifted away from the traditional viral strains of Umbrella and toward the total global saturation of the Uroboros virus. This was the Uroboros Obsession, a plan that moved beyond corporate domination or military superiority and into the realm of absolute biological nihilism. Wesker had spent years refining this new pathogen, which was derived from the progenitor virus found in the Ndipaya wetlands. Unlike the T virus or the G virus, which often resulted in mindless mutation, Uroboros was designed to be a high-fidelity genetic filter. It was the ultimate expression of Wesker's eugenics upbringing. He chose total extinction for the majority of the human race because he was tired of managing a species he deemed stagnant. He wanted a total reset, believing that only those with his specific genetic resilience deserved to walk the earth. The clinical reality of Uroboros was that it was a highly selective and hyper-aggressive organism. If the host's DNA was not compatible, the virus would immediately consume the body in a mass of black, oily tentacles and pustules, turning the individual into a mindless engine of further infection. Wesker viewed this not as a tragedy, but as a natural law. In his mind, he was simply accelerating an evolutionary process that was already overdue. The obsession became so total that he focused all his resources on the creation of a global delivery system, the Shinkansen bomber, to launch the virus into the atmosphere. This was the moment where Wesker stopped being a strategist and became a fanatic. He was no longer interested in ruling the world. He wanted to be the father of a new world that was built from the ashes of the old. Furthermore, the Uroboros obsession was a reflection of Wesker's internal state. He was a man who had been alone his entire life, and he wanted to force the rest of the world into that same state of isolation or perfection. By creating a world of Weskers, he was attempting to solve the problem of his own uniqueness. If everyone was a god, then no one was a god, and the crushing weight of his superiority would finally be shared. The virus was his gospel, and the death of billions was the necessary sacrifice for his new religion. This was the ultimate manifestation of the God complex, where the architect decides that the building is flawed and must be burned down to the foundation. He was willing to be the king of a graveyard, as long as the graveyard was evolved. The legacy of the Uroboros obsession was the total abandonment of the clinical efficiency that had defined his earlier career. He became blinded by the scope of his vision, failing to see the tactical vulnerabilities that were opening up around him. He was so focused on the horizon of his new world that he forgot to watch the ground beneath his feet. This obsession was the final victory for Oswell Spencer. It proved that even after decades of rebellion, Wesker was still carrying out the exact eugenics legacy that had been programmed into him as a child. He was not a rebel god. He was the perfect fulfillment of a dead man's dream, and Uroboros was the final nail in the coffin of the human race. Part 17. Losing control of the virus. By the time the final confrontation in Kijuju reached its peak in the year 2009, the physical and mental state of Albert Wesker was in a state of terminal decline. This was the period of losing control of the virus, where the superhuman reality he had inhabited for over a decade began to collapse. His reliance on the PG-67AW stabilizer had become a catastrophic vulnerability. Because his biology was in a state of constant metabolic flux, any deviation in the dosage of the chemical resulted in severe physical instability and cognitive degradation. During the battle on the Shinkansen bomber, Chris and Sheva managed to overdose him with the stabilizer, causing his vision to blur and his movements to lose their surgical precision. The god was beginning to glitch, and the mask of perfection was finally slipping. The clinical manifestation of this loss of control was a total biological breakdown. In a desperate attempt to regain the upper hand, Wesker deliberately exposed himself to a concentrated mass of the Uroboros virus. He believed that his superior DNA would allow him to control the most aggressive pathogen he had ever created, but he was wrong. The virus began to bond with him in a chaotic and non-selective way. His god form was not a radiant new evolution, but a horrific mass of black tentacles and pulsating mass that consumed his upper body. This was the iron reality of his life. Even he was not truly compatible with the absolute chaos of his own creation. He had spent his life trying to master the virus, only to find that in the end, the virus was the master of him. Furthermore, the loss of physical control mirrored the loss of his mental control. As the virus began to rewrite his brain chemistry, the last of his cold logic was replaced by a volcanic and irrational rage. He stopped thinking like a grandmaster and started acting like a wounded animal. He screamed at the sky and lashed out at his enemies with a lack of tactical focus that would have been unthinkable for the STARS commander. The god complex had turned into a madness of ego, where he could no longer distinguish between his own ambition and the hunger of the virus. He was being eaten from the inside out by the very thing he had worshipped as his divinity. This was the ultimate humiliation for Albert Wesker, to be reduced to a mindless mutation, just like the inferior subjects he had spent his life mocking. The legacy of losing control was the final proof that Wesker's vision was a fallacy. The virus was not an elevator to godhood. It was a fire that consumed everything it touched, including the one who started it. By the time he reached the heart of the volcano, Wesker was no longer a man or a god. He was a biological disaster. This period demonstrates that no amount of genetic engineering can overcome the fundamental laws of nature. Wesker had tried to pick the lock of evolution, and the door had slammed shut on his hand. He died as a mass of writhing black rot, a testament to the fact that power without stability is just a slow way to drown. Part 18. Overconfidence becomes blindness. The fatal flaw that ultimately sealed the fate of Albert Wesker was not a lack of power, but a state of overconfidence becomes blindness. Throughout the final mission in Africa, Wesker operated under the delusion that he was entirely untouchable. This belief led him to toy with Chris Redfield and Sheva Alomar, instead of killing them at the first available opportunity. He viewed the battle as a cinematic validation of his own superiority rather than a tactical necessity. On multiple occasions, he had his enemies at his mercy, but his ego demanded that they witness the launch of Uroboros before they died. He wanted them to acknowledge the magnitude of his victory, which provided them with the crucial seconds they needed to turn the tide against him. His human need for an audience was the very thing that blinded him to the reality of his own mortality. The clinical expression of this blindness was a total failure of situational awareness. Wesker was so convinced of his speed and strength that he ignored the environmental hazards around him. He allowed the battle to move into the heart of an active volcano, a location that negated his tactical advantages and put his failing biology under extreme thermal stress. He believed that even the heat of the earth could not harm a god. This overconfidence was the final evolution of his childhood conditioning. He had been told he was perfect for so long that he had lost the ability to imagine failure. He was a master of unlocking every door except the one that led to his own self-preservation. His rage at Chris was so total that it acted as a psychological blindfold, preventing him from seeing the traps that were being set right in front of him. Furthermore, his blindness extended to the limits of his own technology. He believed that the Shinkansen bomber and the Uroboros virus were infallible tools of his will. He failed to account for the possibility that a weak human could sabotage his delivery system, or that the virus itself could turn against him. This was the arrogance of the laboratory. He had spent so much time looking at the world through a microscope that he forgot how to see the world as it truly was. He died refusing to accept that he had been outplayed by an ordinary soldier. Even as the rocket launchers were leveled at his head, he was still screaming about his right to be a god. His overconfidence was the armor that eventually became his coffin. The legacy of this overconfidence was the total collapse of his bioweapon empire. Because he had centralized everything around his own ego, the moment he fell, the entire structure of the Uroboros project fell with him. He had no contingency plans for his own death, because he did not believe death was a possibility for him. This period serves as a warning about the danger of elitism. Albert Wesker was the smartest man in the room, but he was also the most blind. He died in the lava, not because he was weak, but because he was too arrogant to realize he was in danger. He was a god who was killed by his own reflection, the one he saw in the eyes of the man who refused to bow to him. Part 19. Final confrontation with Chris. The meeting between Albert Wesker and Chris Redfield in the Kijuju Autonomous Zone was the culmination of a decade of tactical escalation and psychological warfare. This was the final confrontation with Chris, a moment that was biologically and emotionally inevitable from the second the Spencer Mansion exploded in 1998. To Wesker, Chris represented the singular anomaly in his world of engineered perfection. No matter how many viral strains Wesker mastered, or how many corporate empires he dismantled, Chris remained the constant variable that refused to be solved. This fight was not about the Uroboros virus or global saturation. It was a desperate attempt by Wesker to destroy the only mirror that reflected his own lingering humanity. He needed to kill Chris to prove that the old world was dead and that the new god was truly absolute. The clinical reality of this inevitability was found in the shared history of the S.T.A.R.S Alpha team. Wesker had spent years grooming Chris to be the peak of human capability, only to find that he had created his own nemesis. The hatred between them was symbiotic. Wesker provided the horror that Chris fought against, and Chris provided the resistance that Wesker used to validate his power. By 2009, this cycle had reached a point of critical mass. Wesker could no longer ignore the fact that an ordinary man without viral enhancements was standing at the threshold of his final sanctuary. The fight in the volcano was the physical manifestation of a psychological collapse, where Wesker's cold logic was replaced by a volcanic rage that mimicked the environment around them. He was no longer a strategist. He was a wounded animal, trying to tear out the heart of the man who knew the truth of his origins. Furthermore, the inevitability was driven by Wesker's own overconfidence. He had toyed with Chris for years, believing that he could end the rivalry at any moment. This arrogance created a vacuum where a real threat was allowed to grow. When the fight finally occurred, Wesker was shocked to find that the gap between God and man had been closed by sheer human will and tactical ingenuity. He found himself in a position where his speed and strength were being countered by someone who had spent every waking moment since Raccoon City preparing for this exact encounter. The confrontation was inevitable because Wesker could not exist in a world where Chris Redfield was still breathing. He needed the silence of his rival to confirm his own divinity, but the silence never came. The legacy of this confrontation was the total exposure of Wesker's fragility. For all his superhuman power, he was still vulnerable to the emotions he claimed to have evolved beyond. He fought Chris not as a god looking down, but as a man looking across at his own failure. This fight proved that the Wesker Project had failed to account for the unpredictable nature of the human spirit. Wesker died because he couldn't stop looking back at the mansion, and Chris lived because he was the only one who truly understood that Wesker was never a god, but just a man with a very dangerous set of toys. The volcano was the only place big enough to contain a hatred that had been brewing for 11 years, and it became the forge where the legend of Albert Wesker was finally melted down into ash. Part 20. Wesker's True Defeat. The physical destruction of Albert Wesker was merely the clinical end of his biological life, but Wesker's true defeat occurred in the moments prior to his incineration. His true defeat was not death, but irrelevance. Wesker spent his entire life trying to be the center of a new world, the master of a global evolution, and the singular ruler of the human race. He wanted to be the architect of a grand design that would endure for centuries. However, in his final moments, he realized that he was just another failed experiment in the long and bloody line of Oswald Spencer's failures. He was not a god. He was a byproduct of a dead man's ego. His true defeat was the realization that the world would move on without him, and that his Uroboros vision was nothing more than a localized biological disaster that would be cleaned up by the very people he despised. The clinical manifestation of this defeat was the collapse of his engineered identity. When the Uroboros virus began to bond with him in a non-selective and chaotic mass, he lost the self that he had cultivated through decades of training and betrayal. He became a biological anomaly, a nameless thing writhing in the heat of the lava. This was the ultimate irony for a man who valued his own ego above all else. He was stripped of his name, his power, and his status, leaving only a mindless hunger. His struggle against Chris was no longer a tactical duel, but a pathetic grasping for a significance that was already gone. He was being erased by the very world he had tried to rewrite. The rocket launchers were just the final punctuation on a sentence that had already been finished by his own failures to transcend his origin as Subject 013. Furthermore, his defeat was a triumph of the ordinary over the engineered. Chris Redfield was a man who had no viral enhancements and no divine mandate, yet he was the one who survived the fire. This reality was the ultimate insult to Wesker's philosophy. It proved that human grit and moral clarity were more resilient than artificial perfection. Wesker died in a state of cognitive dissonance, unable to reconcile his supposed superiority with the reality of his total failure. He was a master of unlocking, who had finally found a door that stayed shut. He died in silence, forgotten by a world that moved on without the evolution he had promised. He became a footnote in the history of bioterrorism, rather than the father of a new species. The legacy of Wesker's true defeat was the total failure of his eugenics ideology. He proved that a man who is manufactured to be a god will always be a monster, because he lacks the foundation of a human soul. His death was not a tragedy for the world, but a moment of relief. He left behind no kingdom and no descendants, only a legacy of blood and a crater in the ground. He was the child who was supposed to rule, but who died as a specimen. His true defeat was the quiet that followed his final scream, a silence that proved that for all his power, Albert Wesker was ultimately just noise in the machinery of history. He died as exactly what he was born, a corporate asset that had outlived its usefulness and was being liquidated by the reality of nature. Part 21. The world he wanted never happens. The most profound failure of Albert Wesker was the realization that the world he wanted never happens, because his vision was fundamentally flawed from the start. Wesker envisioned a Uroboros world, a global landscape defined by a new species of elite superhumans who would rise from the ashes of the old human race. He believed that by saturating the atmosphere with the Uroboros virus, he could force a planetary graduation. However, the clinical reality of the Uroboros pathogen was that it was far too aggressive and non-selective to ever create a stable society. The vision Wesker chased was a nihilistic delusion born from the sterile laboratories of his youth. Even if his plan had succeeded, the resulting world would not have been a utopia of gods, but a silent graveyard of black, oily mass and mindless mutation. The structural flaw in Wesker's vision was the assumption that his own genetic success could be replicated on a mass scale. He viewed himself as the baseline for the new world, but he failed to acknowledge that he was a biological anomaly of 1 in a billion. The Uroboros virus did not create superhumans. It consumed them. The few who might have had the genetic resilience to survive would have found themselves in a world devoid of the complex infrastructure and social order required to sustain a civilization. Wesker wanted to be a king, but he was building a kingdom of rot. He died for a paradise that was actually just a void, proving that his intellectual superiority was blinded by his own megalomania. He was a god who predicted the end of the world, only to find that the world was quite happy to continue without his intervention. Furthermore, Wesker's failure to realize his vision proved that he was never truly in control of the legacy he inherited. He claimed to be creating something new, but he was merely repeating the mistakes of the Umbrella Corporation on a grander scale. He traded the corporate boardrooms of Spencer for a global stage, but the results were the same: blood mutation and ash. The world moved on after his death, not into a new stage of evolution, but into a state of permanent biohazard insecurity. His paradise was never a possibility, because the human race he despised proved to be more resilient than the artificial perfection he championed. He was a man who tried to rewrite the book of life, but forgot that he was just a character in it. The legacy of this failure is the definitive proof that Wesker was a victim of his own hype. He believed his own myth so thoroughly that he lost the ability to perform a basic risk assessment. He was the master of unlocking, but the world he wanted was a door that led to nowhere. This fact demonstrates the total collapse of the Wesker ideology. He was not a savior or a king. He was a biological error who tried to make the rest of the planet share in his mistake. The world he wanted never happened, because the world he wanted was death, and life always finds a way to resist the silence of the laboratory. He was the architect of a ruin that never even had a foundation. Part 22, Spencer versus Wesker, who really won? In the final analysis of the rivalry between the creator and the creation, the question of Spencer versus Wesker, who really won, reveals a bitter and tragic irony. While Albert Wesker successfully murdered Oswell Spencer in his European estate in 2006, he did not truly defeat the old man. In many ways, Spencer achieved a posthumous victory by ensuring that his eugenics legacy would be carried out by the very man who hated him. Wesker spent his entire life trying to escape the shadow of the Wesker Project and the chains of Subject 013, only to fulfill Spencer's exact destructive vision for the human race. Neither man achieved the godhood they craved. They only achieved a shared legacy of global suffering and biological rot. Spencer created a monster that destroyed him, but Wesker became the monster that validated Spencer's darkest theories. The clinical reality of their conflict was a race toward the same abyss. Spencer wanted to be a god through wealth and ancient viruses, while Wesker wanted to be a god through biological evolution and tactical dominance. Both men viewed humanity as a disposable resource, and both men died in isolation, surrounded by the wreckage of their own ambitions. If winning is defined by the fulfillment of one's goals, then both men failed. However, if winning is defined by the lasting impact of one's work, then Spencer is the victor. The world of today is a direct result of Spencer's original research, and Wesker was merely the most efficient delivery system for that poison. Wesker died believing he had transcended his creator, but he died as the perfect instrument of his creator's will. He was the hammer that broke the world, but Spencer was the hand that forged the hammer. Furthermore, the struggle between them was a cycle of trauma that could only end in fire. Spencer won by proving that he could manufacture a human soul that was as cold and predatory as his own. Even in his final moments, when Spencer laughed at Wesker, he was acknowledging that his experiment was a success. He had created a being who was capable of killing his own father without a second thought, which was the ultimate requirement for the New World elite. Wesker's rage at this realization was the final proof that he was still a subject in Spencer's experiment. He killed the man, but he could not kill the idea. The tragedy of their relationship is that they were two sides of the same coin, and when the coin fell, both sides were buried in the dirt. The legacy of the Spencer versus Wesker rivalry is a world that is permanently haunted by the arrogance of two men. They turned the planet into a laboratory for their personal feud, and billions of people have paid the price for their elite egos. Neither man is a hero, and neither man is a winner. They are the twin architects of a global nightmare, each believing they were the hero of their own story, while being the villain of everyone else's. The bitter irony is that in his attempt to be the ultimate master of unlocking Wesker, only succeeded in unlocking the final door of Spencer's design. They are both gone now, but the blood they spilled continues to flow through the veins of every new outbreak. Part 23. Wesker's influence on future villains. Even in death, Albert Wesker remains the definitive blueprint for the modern bioterrorist, and his shadow looms over every major antagonist who followed in the Resident Evil universe. The Wesker's influence on future villains is characterized by the transition from corporate greed to individual megalomania. Figures like Carla Radams, Alex Wesker, and even the various leaders of the Connections were all operating within the paradigm that Albert established. He proved that a single intelligent ego with access to viral resources is more dangerous than an entire multinational corporation. He showed that the virus is not just a weapon, but a tool for personal deification. Every villain who seeks to rewrite the human genome or to purge the weak is an intellectual descendant of the boy from the 1960s who decided to be a god. The clinical expression of this influence is seen in the decentralization of biohazard research. Wesker took the secrets of Umbrella and scattered them across the globe, ensuring that the threat would never be contained in a single location. This allowed for the rise of smaller, more agile organizations that utilize Wesker's tactical data to conduct their own experiments. His obsession with the Alpha Team survivors also set the stage for the personal vendettas that define the modern era of bioterrorism. He turned the war against viruses into a war against specific people, creating a cycle of revenge that continues to fuel the conflict. He was the first to show that a biological organic weapon is most effective when it is guided by a human mind that has completely lost its connection to morality. Furthermore, Wesker's influence is felt in the biological architecture of modern pathogens. The research he conducted on the T. virus, G virus, and T. veronica provided the foundational data for the creation of the C virus and the mold. He was the one who pioneered the integration of viral agents with advanced chemical stabilizers, proving that the leash was as important as the bite. Every new creature that emerges from a laboratory carries a piece of Wesker's legacy in its DNA. He is the ghost in the machine of the biohazard era, the name that is spoken with a mixture of awe and terror by those who seek to follow in his footsteps. He proved that a man can be killed, but a legacy of blood is immortal. The sorrow of Wesker's influence is the realization that the world will never be truly rid of him. As long as his research exists, Albert Wesker is still alive in every needle and every vial. He turned the pursuit of science into a pursuit of slaughter, and the world has yet to find a way to reverse that process. He was the ultimate master of unlocking the dark potential of the human spirit, and the doors he opened can never be closed. Future villains will continue to look to him as a god, not because he succeeded, but because he had the courage to try and burn the world down. He is the patron saint of the apocalypse, a monument to the idea that power is the only thing that matters. Part 24. Could Wesker have won? The question of could Wesker have won is a fascinating exercise in tactical analysis that reveals the profound role of human emotion in his eventual downfall. From a purely technical and biological standpoint, Wesker should have been victorious. He possessed superhuman speed strength and a global network of bioweapon resources that dwarfed the capabilities of the BSAA. If Wesker had stayed in the shadows and avoided engaging in a personal vendetta with Chris Redfield, the Uroboros project likely would have been launched successfully. His divine plan was sound, but his human need for revenge was the one variable he could not control. He was a god who was defeated by his own petty grievances. If he had simply ignored his past, he could have owned the future. The clinical reason for his defeat was his inability to prioritize the mission over his ego. Wesker spent an irrational amount of time and energy trying to break the spirit of the STARS survivors, instead of focusing on the logistical security of his global saturation plan. He allowed Chris to get close enough to discover his chemical dependence and his physiological weaknesses. He turned a tactical operation into a dramatic stage play where he was the star and the heroes were the audience. This overconfidence was the singular crack in his artificial perfection. If he had been as cold and detached as he claimed to be, he would have killed Chris in 1998 and moved on to his godhood without a second thought. But Wesker needed Chris to see him win, and that need for validation was his death sentence. Furthermore, Wesker's victory was prevented by the very eugenics ideology he championed. By creating a virus like Uroboros that required a near impossible genetic compatibility, he ensured that his new world would have no army and no subjects. Even if the bomb had launched, Wesker would have been the king of a planet of black oily mass with no one left to rule. He was a master of unlocking doors, but he never stopped to ask if the room on the other side was worth entering. His win condition was a paradox. To be a god, he needed to destroy the very thing that made godhood meaningful. His arrogance blinded him to the fact that absolute power is absolute isolation. He lost the moment he decided that the human race was not worth managing. The legacy of this question is the realization that Wesker was his own greatest enemy. He was defeated by the Albert part of Albert Wesker, the part that still remembered the mansion, the part that still hated Spencer, and the part that still wanted to prove he was the best. He was a man who had everything, but couldn't let go of the one thing he didn't have: the respect of his rivals. He died in a volcano because he wanted to win a fight instead of winning a war. This fact serves as the final tactical verdict on his life. Wesker was a superior biological weapon, but he was a failed strategic mind. He was a god with a grudge, and in the world of biohazard, that is the most lethal combination possible. Part the 25, Final Verdict, Tragedy. not just evil. The final verdict on the life of Albert Wesker is that his story is one of profound and unavoidable tragedy, not just evil. To analyze Wesker is to see a man who was never allowed to be a man. From the moment of his genetic selection in the 1960s, he was treated as an asset, a subject, and a weapon. He was born in a sterile laboratory and raised in an environment where his worth was measured only by his tactical utility. He became a monster because the world never offered him the chance to be anything else. The iron reality of his life is that he was a victim of a corporate machine that valued power over life, and he spent his entire existence trying to build a new world out of the wreckage of the old one. He was the perfect creation of a world that has forgotten its own humanity. The clinical tragedy of Wesker is the total erasure of his autonomy. Even in his rebellion against Spencer, he was still carrying out the exact eugenics legacy that had been programmed into him as a child. He was a prisoner of his own DNA, incapable of escaping the shadow of his creator. His God complex was a defense mechanism, a way to cope with the fact that he was essentially a biological product. He wanted to rule the world because he had never been allowed to rule himself. The sorrow of his final analysis is the realization that if he had been born in a different world, Albert Wesker might have been a true hero. He had the intellect, the courage, and the drive to change the world for the better, but those traits were twisted into tools of destruction by the men who owned his life. Furthermore, his evil was a logical response to a world that he viewed as inherently predatory. He saw the rot of Umbrella and the weakness of the government, and he decided that the only way to survive was to become the ultimate predator. His nihilism was the result of a lifetime of betrayal. He was a man who had been lied to by everyone he ever trusted, from Spencer to the RPD. His downfall was inevitable because he had no foundation of love or empathy to ground him. He was like a skyscraper built without a core. He could reach the clouds, but the first storm was always going to bring him down. He was a god made of glass, and his life was the sound of the shattering. The final legacy of Albert Wesker is a warning about the cost of artificial evolution and the danger of treating human beings as data points. He is the definitive proof that we cannot manufacture a superior human being, because humanity is not a collection of genetic traits, but a state of the heart. He died in a volcano, not as a king, but as a failed project, a ghost of the 20th century that was consumed by its own fire. His story ends in a grave of lava, a permanent reminder that the pursuit of perfection leads only to the void. Albert Wesker was a man who tried to unlock the secrets of the universe, only to find that the ultimate secret is that we are enough just as we are. He was a tragedy of biology and a victim of history, and his silence is the final verdict on the Wesker Project.